But in this case, I will ask our next keynote presenter, Dr. Elisabeth Tietmeyer from Germany, from Berlin, to come here and take the place and give us a talk about making another or remaking an exhibition which was opened just recently, a few months ago. And Dr. Tietmeyer is a deputy director in the Museum of European Cultures in Berlin, which has background in ethnology, folk life, and so on, but it is now about European cultures, also contemporary topics, and so on. So the struggles of making the new exhibition. Do you need? Yes, do you need? So you are very welcome here. And the floor is yours for the next very exciting talk.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much for having invited me. I'm very happy to be here. For this is the first time I've been to Estonia and meet my dear colleagues from the National Museum here in Tartu, since this museum is our partner or a sister museum, we call it. Well, I would like to tell you something about our museum, our history of the museum, and the structure and content of the new exhibition. And I really learned that our permanent exhibition is totally different from the Liverpool Museum in many ways, but you will hear it. And after that I will tell you something about our tasks, the museum tasks, and how the reactions have been so far of, on the permanent exhibition. Now, we just reopened our house with a small permanent exhibition called Cultural Contexts Living in Europe. And up to that time, the museum presented long and short-lived exhibitions, each devoted to a different special ethnographic or cultural historical topic. And although most of these exhibitions were quite popular, the museum seemed not to be able to communicate its identity to the visitors. And thus we decided to develop and put up a permanent exhibition for the first time. As we already heard, there is no permanent exhibition, of course. We always will change some topics, of course. But it's not a special or temporary exhibition. And the difficult task was to present a cross-section of the vast museum's collections on the one hand, and on the other to pick up Europe out as a central theme. Now, let me tell you something about the ethnographic collection, the history, and about our museum, of course, first. Our museum is one of the 15 national museums in Berlin, which belong to the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, and you see it over there. There's the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which different institutions, archives and libraries, and also the national museums in Berlin. And to these national museums belong 15 museums and several research institutes. And among the museums, there are two ethnographic ones, one for non-European cultures and one for European cultures. And this is our museum. With about 275,000 objects, the museum houses one of the largest collections of everyday culture and popular art in Europe, and spanning the period from 18th century to the present. And here you have some ideas how our objects look like. And thus it specializes on questions concerning quotidian and social aspects, on cultural similarities and differences in Europe on the one side, by explaining the intermingling of cultural patterns, and on the other side by discussing group identities, as well as by tracing the history of European cultural phenomena. And the theoretical basis for this is the scientific differentiation of the term culture. And this is not the definition generally accepted in Europe as culture as art or music or literature. It refers to cultural expressions such as cultural domains or symbolic culture, subculture, or ethnic, regional, national, and supranational culture. But culture is not a static entity, of course. It is seen as a process. It has a dynamic character. And thus, this also refers to the contacts between cultures and contacts between social strata within Europe. And moreover, relations between European and non-European and the latter's interpretation of European cultural phenomena would also be issues for discussion. And the name of our museum obviously implies a conscious decision against using the German term European culture in the singular, because from a European vantage point, this escapes definition, just as, for example, the term German culture. They're also a plural, always cultures for us. Our museum was founded in 1999 as a result of merging the former Museum of German Folklore or Folk Life with the European collections of the Ethnological or Anthropological Museum in the southwestern part of Berlin, called Dahlem. This is a little village belonging to Berlin. It first occupied a space vacated after the former permanent exhibition of the German Folklore Museum was dismantled. And because of organizational reason, the national museums, our museum was forced in 2005 to move its exhibition to the then vacant historical halls of the neighboring huge museum site called Dahlem Museums, where the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art are located. And as I told you before, the MAC has been reopened last year with a second entrance over there. But before I come to the new exhibition, let me outline briefly the historical ethnographic collections, because this is very important also for the museum and the permanent exhibition. These collections originated with the Royal Prussian Art Cabinet of the 17th century. Later on, it presented all its collections at the so-called Museums Island. You know this in Berlin, perhaps, in the center of Berlin, from 1830s onwards. The Ethnological Museum, founded as an autonomous museum in 1873, got its own building in 1886. And it dedicated itself to collecting and exhibiting artifacts of all those people thought to be without history. Thus, the cultures of the nations of Western and Central Europe, with their extensive written history, were not regarded as subject for ethnological investigation. But nevertheless, the Ethnological Museum did own European objects, although acquired haphazardly. And all of them were shown in the so-called European Cabinet, which was located between the ethnographic and the prehistoric exhibits in the new museum at Museums Island. When the Ethnological Museum moved into its own building in 1886, any German or European objects were exhibited because of lack of space. And that is why the scientist Rudolf Virchow founded the Museum for German Traditional Costumes and Domestic Products on a private basis in 1889. And this was awarded the status of autonomy as the Museum of German Folklore in 1934. It exhibited objects used by the lower and middle classes of different German or German-speaking regions, like you see here. And comparable objects from European countries bordering Germany were also on display. And those European objects, still part of the Ethnological Museum, were considered of little interest until 1934, parallel to the establishment of the Museum of European Folklore, Museum of German Folklore, an independent Eurasian department was set up in the Ethnological Museum. And this, the result of this was that the Museum of German Folklore was forced to hand over its European non-German objects to the new department and vice versa. And this was, of course, done against the background of the National Socialist ideology of that time. The partition of Germany after the Second World War left some of the national museums divided between East and West Berlin, and the Museum of German Folklore suffered this fate too. In East Berlin, the museum revised its national way of looking at culture and again became involved in comparable European studies. And its namesake in West Berlin began organizing joint exhibitions and cooperations with the Ethnological Museum's European department. This cooperation reached its peak during the 1980s. But the permanent exhibition, the Museum of German Folklore still showed aspects of living in Germany's middle and lower classes, mainly in the 19th century, in an abstract and structured way. Towards the end of the 80s, the national museums in West Berlin came up with the idea of Europeanizing the German Folklore Museum by merging it with the European department of the Ethnological Museum. And as Europe became more united, it was no longer appropriate to have two institutions, one with a nearly exclusive German ethnographic collection and another with an analogous collection from the rest of Europe, located in a museum which exclusively concentrated on non-European cultures. And above all, the European department has never been on permanent display in this huge ethnological museum. And after the reunification of the two German states, which was followed by the reunification of the museums in 1992, this idea was revived. Thus, a plan to establish a Museum of European Ethnology with a focus on German cultures was implemented. And in the beginning, there were problems deciding on an appropriate profile and subject matter. And this was strongly influenced by the teaching and research programs of the German universities, which had always strictly distinguished between ethnology or anthropology on the one hand and German folklore or folk life on the other, and each field governed by a century-old academic tradition. But there was a slow change taking place in the two disciplines, which, in order to expand their scientific scope, have both increasingly turned towards studying European cultures too. And this had led somehow to a convergence of the scientific approaches of the two disciplines, and the foundation of the Museum of European Cultures was a reflection of this development also. It finally opened then 13 years ago with a pilot exhibition called Fascinating Picture, Cultural Contexts in Europe. Now, in the forthcoming years, we organized a lot of exhibitions which lasted from 3 months to several years with accompanying publications like EU-funded projects, and we worked together with the Liverpool Museum also in this project, for example. And we had a lot of events and event series like the European Cultural Days, which I shall explain later on to you. Now I'm coming to the exhibition. In the course of renovating the historical museum's building at the museum site in Dahlem since 2009, we took the chance, reflecting the former exhibition approach, and decided to implement, well, a long-term or permanent exhibition presented on only 700 square meters. It's a very small exhibition. And the development and realization of a new concept posed to be a challenge, since older presentations of mere object groups like textiles or ceramics, household utensils, or the life world of ethnic or national groups in Germany or Europe seemed to be outdated. Curators, architects, and designers were confronted with several demands and conditions. First, there was our task to present a cross-section of the varied museum's collection, documenting everyday life. You already hear that the focus is on collections. Second, as the general theme should refer to actual discussions of society, we had to think about systematically collecting present-day objects. Third, we felt obliged also to fulfill visitors' wishes. I will tell you later on. And fourth, the concept had to be adapted to the difficult spatial situation of the historical building. And fifth, to raise Europe as an issue without defining in a few sentences what Europe is and where it ends. Very difficult. And sixth, a complex theme which reflected the profile of our museum, like cultural contexts or cultural locations or identities in Europe, had to be communicated in a simple and clearly structured way. And thus it was not that easy to develop the relevant themes, to select objects from cultural history and the present, and to write the corresponding texts, to organize visual media illustrating spheres of action which interlink the inhabitants of Europe, but also distinguish them from one another. Now, the exhibition is made up of 13 thematic modules, respectively separated in content and design terms by a group of display cases. And these showcase landscapes hence resemble somehow islands and present objects, texts, and media in regard to a specific topic. And that is why we call them themed island. The objects are not presented like on a stage where they could have been lost out of sight, perhaps. On the opposite, they are in the center of the exhibition, shown in different kinds and showcases, where the bigger ones we put on a pedestal, like you see here, the showcase and also the pedestal, and the texts also. There are 3 bigger rooms devoted to one topic, introduced by one division text with one photo. You see it here. This is the room text and one photo. All topics are contextualized by written or spoken texts and electronic media, which are located either at the walls or on the showcases. And every themed island is introduced by a so-called section text and 2 photos with very general descriptions of big topics like cultural contexts via trade or migration in Europe, and which after all are presented by examples like trade of beads or food culture. Thus, to deepen the general information given in the section text, they are written the relevant group text with the photos or with none, with 4 photos or with none, as long as they are found directly on the showcase. Like you see here, it's not very good. These are also the section text and group text, and this is section text or group text written on the showcase. And the 4th level of contextualization belongs to the captions and, of course, the explanatory text of the objects themselves. And the length of the text depends on the importance of the object, but also of the sometimes limited space. We know this. This is always quite difficult. And some objects have a really interesting biography stated in the descriptions of the objects. Like here you have the description of the objects, or here by the gondola. This is a very interesting object biography. And every text is numbered. Roman numbers for the division texts and Indian numbers for the other kind of text, whereas the deepening level of the group text is reflected by the subdivided number. And the reason we did this is to offer the visitor a better orientation when he looks at the exhibition on his own. And the media, partly interactive, either show filmic impressions contextualizing a topic, or they inform via photos and text about the European history. You can listen to interviews, of course, to stories, to musical recordings. After all, the media serve like the written texts and photos to deepen the knowledge of the presented objects. The exhibition itself presents form and consequences of cultural contexts in a comparative manner. Ethnographic objects and testimonies of cultural history from Europe, and also occasionally other continents, are introduced as physical evidence for the topics: encounters, borders, and religiosity in 3 rooms. And here, well, it's not very good. You have here the exhibition space. This is the first room, the second room, third room, and to the fourth I'm coming later. Looking at the exhibition reveals that Europe, despite the diversity of its cultures and their manifestations, is vested with a cultural concord which distinguishes it from other continents, but also from individual national perspectives. The Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset was hence already able to comment in 1929, I quote this: "If we were to imagine that we should merely live with what we are as nationals, and if we would, for example, try to deprive the average German, for example, of all the customs, thoughts, and feelings he or she has adopted from other countries of the continent, we would be shocked by how impossible such an existence already is. 4/5 of our inner wealth are the common property of Europe." Quote. And we say that this is most of all attributable to the mobile behavior of the people in and to Europe. On the one hand, it brought about culture encounters and commonalities, which have led to cultural changes and the development of hybrid global cultures or communities, and still does, of course. And on the other, it continually gives rise to questions regarding the identity of individuals and groups within Europe who attempt to counter fears of loss or uncertainty, or express their ties to their homeland or to their home, sometimes with a wish for segregation. And the consequence of these apparently contradictory tendencies is the cultural diversity within the unity of Europe. Now, the topics of trade, travel, media, and migration in the first room of the exhibition serve to present the effects and consequences of cultural contexts within and with Europe. And this room is dominated, as you've seen before, by an original gondola from Venice, 11 meters long, and it acts as the exhibition's guiding object, because all the topics presented here are directly or indirectly related to the most famous European cities. By virtue of her historic, economic, and political importance, Venice has influenced the fate of Europe over centuries, and is still, even today, in demand as a location for travelers like tourists and also people looking for work. And the first themed island, as I told you before, first themed island in that room, hence introduces the effects on European trade relations. And we exemplified this by silk and glass bead objects from various European regions. And the trade in these goods was closely linked to Venice, of course, from the 12th century, before the knowledge about their production, the establishment of manufacturing locations, and the distribution of products spread to further regions and towns from the 16th century onwards, and effectuated the development of wide-ranging trading networks. And here you see some of the objects. The second thematic island is dedicated to the outcomes of the type of cultural contexts by way of travel. While travel had remained the reserve of the privileged classes in Europe until the 18th century, the urge to explore familiar and alien worlds subsequently were characterized by the journeys of scholars, artists, and scientists. And from the mid-19th century, travel became increasingly popular and financially affordable, of course. And the towns, islands, and regions of Italy have meanwhile remained popular travel destinations in Europe to this day. The third themed island uses two examples to explain how indirect cultural contexts are abetted by early media, which spread information and intercede between people. One of the earliest media is the picture, able to mirror contemporary events and experiences, and with printing methods improved by movable type around 1440 and the invention of lithography at the end of the 19th century, pictures enjoyed increasing mobility and, thanks to their wide distribution, of course, also popularity. And most of all, the age of industrialization, the world's events and specifics reached people at home by way of pictures in many shapes and forms, be it as illustrated theater performances, as pieces of furniture, or as decorations. And the fourth thematic island is devoted to the topic of migration, which has characterized mankind from the beginning of time as the classic form of cultural context, thus just as the European region has been defined by migratory movements for 3,000 years. And this included small-scale population shifts from or to regions or places as much as the larger emigration or immigration movements, which have particularly shaped Europe in its present form since the 19th century. And their effects and outcomes are much too varied, of course, to even start to list them all, much less exhibit them all. But they are recognizable most clearly and sustainably in culinary and Epicurean culture. Migrants and also, of course, trade brought dishes, beverages, and stimulants to Europe centuries ago that were still deemed exotic at that time. And today they are part of everyday culture and have become globalized. Now, when people from different cultural backgrounds meet, at least one of them has crossed geographical borders by leaving his or her place of origin. And this process is not always without conflict and often has negative consequences, particularly for the immigrant. And how Europeans localize their culture, how they are able to identify with the territory, is shown in the second exhibition room with further themed islands. Oh, sorry, I forgot this. Several objects, the historical and the present-day objects as an outcome of migration. Now, this is the second room. Local, regional, national, and supranational sightings of culture are introduced with various exemplary objects from European life worlds. Many people identify their culture with a location or region they call their home. And when they share this feeling with other people, often conveyed, of course, by a common language, they form a group which is different from other groups or set itself apart. And such demarcations, however, are not rigid but permeable. They do not prevent people from coming into contact, of course, who will instead be more likely to influence one another. And thus, a separation of the local from the regional from the national is impossible, of course, we know this. Many people in Europe, nonetheless, challenge what they deem increasing Europeanization or globalization. And as a response, this can entail a return to one's own culture, mediating a feeling of familiarity. And it is not unusual for these uncertainties or insecurities to be politically instrumentalized by suggesting that a space is congruent with a homogeneous culture. But this falls short, of course, of the realities where cultures can overlap, straddle spaces, or are of a translocal culture. And cultural attributes which are typical for a locale a region or a nation nevertheless exist, however. How varied and yet similar local sightings of culture can be in Europe and have been is shown in the fifth thematic island of the exhibition. The objects drawn from the domains of clothing, clubs, and societies, customs, or marketing represent localities in Europe or are regarded as typical for scientific locations. They are an expression of the self-esteem felt by the natives and their identification with the local. And the typical culture of a locality, tangible or intangible, is always integrated in the respective cultural region, of course. In 18th or 19th century regional rural costume or custom involving masks, for example, could hence also include variations that were typical for a locale and hence made their respective origin discernible. And against this background, the sixth themed island highlights the regional sightings of culture with the help of masks and traditional costumes, among other items. And you see the part of the exhibition section. The costumes were reinvented in the 19th century in response to urbanization and regarded as typical for a cultural landscape, but also for an ethnic group. And this can partly still apply today or again. And as the places people call their home increasingly dissolve, their residents endeavor to preserve or establish their regional, ethnic, or local identity. In order to visibly demonstrate their sense of a common bond, groups of the most varied kind may take to uniforming. And by way of an excursion in this exhibition, the seventh themed island shows selected photographs taken by a German artist named Sabine von Bassewitz, who has documented how groups present themselves in Germany. And these also included societies for traditional costumes, which can be found in many European regions, as we all know, along with local history associations and dance and music groups. And they dedicate themselves to the preservation of their cultural heritage and also to living it. And the rediscovery of rural life has been going apace for some time now, at least in Germany. I don't know how it is in other European countries, but in Germany it's the case. Occasionally attended by transfiguration or new invention. And this can, of course, take on folkloristic and localist features when elements of a culture that are no longer known exactly are supposedly reconstructed and taken for real, and when the emotional attachment to one's own culture gets out of hand. And that regional cultures have always also carried national connotations has not changed to this day. But as opposed to regional culture, national sightings of culture hardly find any expression in the material culture of everyday life. They most of all surface on a symbolic, musical, textual, and pictorial level. And the eighth themed island treats of this by looking at the so-called national personifications and presenting visual portrayals of national stereotypes. And populist politicians use stereotypes to ostracize alleged opponents in their own country or cast slurs on other countries, as has become clearly evident in the dictatorships and wars within Europe. And the most positive identification with a nation today, however, more than ever before, occurs in sports. In particular, the globally inclusive Olympic Games. And such competitions, their athletes and fans use symbols in the respective national colors or other colors combination, such as in football, as a mark of national representation or of that followers. Now, if national cultures find hardly any reflection in quotidian things, the same surely applies exponentially for a supranational or European culture. An art installation made of recycled material by a Berlin fashion designer named Stefan Hann is shown then in the 9th thematic islands to scrutinize a supranational sighting of culture. And the founders of and persons responsible for the European Economic Union, today European Union, may have created a complex system of symbols, but there is hardly any shared visible culture in everyday life in Europe, discounting pan-European music and sport events or cultural initiatives such as the European Capital of Culture. For many Europeans, Europe as a political and cultural construct is much too abstract for wishing to identify with it. It only takes on a more concrete shape for them from a geographical or cultural distance, or when they feel somehow beset by immigrants from a Eurocentric perspective and isolate themselves from other continents and their population. But there is nonetheless an awareness of a shared European history shaped by small and large-scale trade relations going back centuries, by wars, by joint and opposed policies. Yet, what has most of all lastingly shaped life in Europe since the Middle Ages has been the Christian religion with its connections to Judaism and Islam. And that is the subject of the third exhibition room, which explores how religions and traditions structure people's lives. Against this background, the 10th themed island looks into various expressions of piety in everyday life. And they are boundless in their variety and number, as well as their geographical distribution within and outside Europe. Religions are translocal, of course, with regionally or locally typical manifestations and independent traditions, which is best illustrated by customs marking the course of the year, as you all know, including the celebration of Christmas with nativity scenes, for example. And the 11th themed island illustrates this by using the examples from Africa, Latin America, and Europe. And also the missionaries will play a role there. Outstanding and unique amongst them are the Nativity or Christmas Mountain, to be found in German Saxony, Czech Bohemia, and Austrian Tyrol from the 19th century. A mechanical Christmas mountain from the German Erzgebirge, or Ore Mountains also called, 12 meters long, can be seen in the 12th and 13th island as an example. And this is typical for this region and simultaneously an outcome of cultural syncretism by combining Catholic traditions from Bohemia with Protestant traditions from Saxony, whilst integrating also the live mining world from the Erzgebirge. And this Christmas mountain, at the end of the exhibition, hence echoes the gondola as its beginning by signifying the numerous links between people in Europe. Now, how do we try to keep this exhibition, which I just outlined to you, dynamic? Now, the task areas of any museum dealing with the past and the present day-to-day culture are, as you all know, manifold. And by preserving the cultural heritage of a location, a region, or a country, each depending on its orientation, of course, it can help people find their identity and contribute to their self-affirmation. And this heritage can be multifaceted indeed and spring from various cultural roots, because cultures are never static. Museums not only preserve cultural heritage, but also provide a platform for examining current social, political issues, for encountering other cultures, and for enabling the audience's participation in museums' work within the meaning of the ICOM Code of Ethics for Museums. We take this quite serious. And there it is written, amongst other rules, museums work in close collaborations with the communities from which their collections originate as well as those they serve. And with its transnational orientation, the Museum of European Cultures sees itself right at the center of this field of tension created by conflicting demands. And to meet them, it deploys specific management instruments. On the one hand, it would like to allow the public greater insight into its collections than heretofore. And for this reason, we have attached in a fourth room a small study collection, we call it a so-called study collection, to the main exhibition, where various objects or group objects from its rich holdings are shown in presentations which are changed at regular intervals. Because people really like to see different object groups. We were always asked by people, well, do show this, please show that, and we really want to cope with them and to show them the different groups of objects. And in this study collection, anybody who is interested in the individual objects over and beyond this can find more information on the online in the museum's documentation systems. There's 3 other photos. Now, on the other hand, we would like to underscore the European orientation of the main exhibition by putting up special exhibitions, of course, accompanying them, the general exhibition, and by continuing our series of the, as I said before, European Cultural Days, which involve a European country or a region and people from Europe introduced under a specific theme. And the Cultural Days last up to 4 weeks and comprise an exhibition, a small one, as well as a supporting program. And they are usually organized in cooperation with the European cultural institutes, associations, communities, and the respective embassies in Berlin. They all are in Berlin. And occasionally also with the corresponding partner museums of Europe, of the renovating countries. So in this case, we have also cooperated with this museum in 2002 when we made the Estonian Cultural Days in our museum. And events such as these are designed to re-establish the museum as a forum for intercultural contacts and to breathe life into the main exhibition. And this not only serves to demonstrate what is interesting or what interesting, superb and beautiful cultural achievements people have been capable of and still are. And the creators of this museum hope that the themes presented will also animate the debate on issues which stir people in Europe. And how do the reactions look so far? We think that we opened this exhibition right on time regarding the financial and political crisis of Europe. At least the reactions of the media gave us this impression, for it was overwhelming. We did not expect that at all, since we thought that the topic of Europe is too abstract. And of course there are criticisms, sure, because of the lack of historical deepness, for example, or the small dimensions of the exhibition. Of course, they are right. But the reports altogether were quite positive. And up to now, also most of the visitors have been satisfied, especially when they were offered a guided tour, of course. There are also critical comments written in our guest book stating that they missed the presentation of German cultural history. Yes. Like our predecessor, the German Folklore Museum, did in the 70s. But they, of course, didn't know that, of course, this museum never showed the entire cultural history of Germany, but it was their feeling anyhow. And in the main exhibition, we also tried to fulfill visitors' wishes, and many of them were asking for textiles, to see the textiles again, to see Christmas nativity scenes again. And of course, it was no problem for us to put also these items on display again, concerning to a certain topic, of course. And the professional regions, the teachers and students of our disciplines like anthropology, ethnography, or museum studies, they are by all means positive, since our thematic approach concerning mobilities and identities is part of the actual scientific discourse in Germany. And above all, everybody agreed to our consistent practice to collect present-day objects and to show them in nearly every topic of the exhibition. And this gives also the impression that the exhibition is not old-fashioned, but has got something to do with the everyday life of the visitors. And this is one of our most ambitious aims, to pick up on and proceed from wherever the visitors stand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the overview. Again, a question or two. Kas teil on küsimusi? Jaa. You don't have your head.
Many thanks for your interesting lecture. Could you tell us in short when and how are collected the ethnographical pieces of other European nations in your museum?
Yes, I do. Shall I will go here. Yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, I missed that because I didn't have so much time to tell you something about this. You see, the European collections from different countries, and we have from Estonia very many objects. The European collection was part of the Ethnological Museum, and anthropologists were working there. And anthropologists were making collection journeys and did field work in European countries, in different European countries. And so many of the people were going, let's say, to the Sami people in Northern Europe and made field work there and collected items. They made in former times somehow expeditions. And then there were also people who were making field work in Estonia or collection journeys and collected objects there. We have, for example, a very huge jewelry collection from Estonia. And then also the Museum of German Folklore had also objects from different European countries, because there were many collectors also who were living in the respective country in Europe, and they collected objects there and gave it as a gift, as a present to the Museum of German Folklore and also to the Museum of Ethnology. And that's why we got European objects. I myself, for example, did a field work in the Ukraine and among the Crimean Tatars, and I collected objects from them also. So this is a very normal way for anthropologists to go outside, make field works there, did some research, and collect items. Yeah.
Should I wait for them? Okay. Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask regarding to the previous topic also, like what are your experiences on the topics that are kind of controversial or bold, kind of like to do with Second World War, migration and so on? Do you also, are you a museum that raises those questions that are challenging for the society and people?
Well, yes, we have these topics also in our permanent exhibition, although they are really only in texts and also some objects. The exhibition is too small to raise these fundamental questions. Well, of course, we ask the question, what is Europe? And as I told you at the end of my, at the end of the lecture, that people criticize Europe, and then they feel like Europeans when they feel beset. And we raised this question at the end of the second room, of course. And then, of course, we have this topic migration. And we also write in the text that there are really conflicts, but we show different kinds of. We show the outcomes of the migration, the hybrid culture. Let's say, as an example, food culture, like the doner kebab culture. The doner kebab in the bread was invented in Berlin, as you perhaps might know. And people feel, okay, yeah, this is our culture. We are Berliners, and, well, of course, it was invented by Turkish guest workers. But we don't raise the question how difficult it is to live together, the different communities who are living together in Berlin or in Germany or in Europe. And of course we will make events and special exhibitions where we put up these questions. But the permanent exhibition is too small to raise these questions. Only a little we do.
I wonder, you told us that you're working with embassies and
Yeah.
for this one cultural day or month
Days, yeah.
every year.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that express itself in the permanent exhibition? I didn't see any picture. Is that in the permanent, or do you have a special?
No, it's a special event. You see, we have different objects from all over Europe in the permanent exhibition.
Okay.
Each devoted to a certain topic. And when we make the cultural days, we have, of course, let's say in this year, we doing the Apulian cultural days. It's a region in the southeast of Italy. And we also have objects from Apulia in the exhibition. And that is why we tell the people, okay, we have Apulian objects, but then we have these cultural days with a separate special exhibition from the region or the city, and have a lot of events during the four weeks where we do the cultural days. And all the cultural days are connected somehow via the objects with the permanent exhibition. And the most important thing is the cultural days. We are really keen of exploring new target groups. And that's why we are working together with the communities in Berlin. Let's say the Apulian community, or we had the Sardinian cultural days. We worked together with the Sardinian community. You see, we have many, many communities in Berlin, and that is why the people are really coming into our museum, because of these cultural days. It's something from there.
Okay, I would like to thank the presenters.